Hey everyone, welcome to the May edition of the TLC podcast. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York, and today I'm talking to Stephen Gow. And Stephen is a Leverhume Research Fellow at Edinburgh Napier University. He's a former Assessment and Academic Integrity Coordinator here at York. He was also the inaugural guest of this very podcast, which is no doubt front and centre of his resume. Stephen and I talk about his work on the StudentXGenAI Project, which he's been working on for the last 2 years with Sam Illingworth. And we go through some of the headline findings of this project on student use of AI in university and how some of these cast doubt on the idea that everyone's using it. So we talk about what all this means for university teaching and assessment and the direction of higher ed with its response to AI. So as always, links to all of this in the show notes, along with a signpost to Stephen and Sam's Advanced HE blog, which covers some of the highlights of this conversation in more detail and has graphs. So with that, I bring you Stephen Gow. Anyway, how's your Duolingo streak doing?
Oh, my son has taken over my Duolingo streak, and it's on to like 320. But I have to keep it up when it pings me before midnight saying he hasn't done it today. Yeah, so that's where I am. Languages have taken a bit of a backseat, although today my kid's Chinese teacher starts. So they've got a Chinese teacher. They're 8 and 10. So they're going to have a Chinese teacher once a week who's a PhD student here at York. So we're going to, so with that, I was thinking, well, maybe I could do a GCSE in Chinese and keep ahead of them. I mean, I know Chinese anyway, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But I think it would be great for them to get a Chinese GCSE before they do their GCSEs. And we were discussing about Duolingo, and it can be useful if you were to do like an hour on it. You should be, I don't know whether you can, but you should be able to set a lower limit on what it takes for you to get a streak. It shouldn't be that you can just do a word, a quick word thing that takes like 2 minutes. It should be like, right, you have a streak, but you've done an hour a day, and then it would start to work better. I assume maybe you can do that. I haven't checked that.
I know it's not. So I know it's not the topic at hand, but I do think it's really it's the mechanics of Duolingo is really interesting because it's like takes a lot of shit basically. I know people criticize it a lot for being engagement over learning, and I'm sure there's an element of that. But it's like there's parts of it which are the recall, the retrieval practice, very spaced, tiny amounts a day. I don't think it was ever intended to be a replacement for tuition, or it was an augmentation rather than the bulk of your progress. You feel you're making more progress early on in the language. Yeah, I think once you get to intermediate, it's probably like you can probably forego the streak. You get that kind of like the sweats at 5 minutes to midnight when you realise you haven't done your streak. But I think
definitely. Yeah, I think it definitely ties in with where we're going with AI and learning analytics and things along those lines in the impact of nudging people to do the learning. Because obviously you've got to have the sort of intrinsic motivation to want to learn a language in order to download it and start doing it. But then it does become, the streak is extrinsic motivation for you to keep the streak up. And then it becomes very much about keeping the streak up rather than learning the language.
Yeah, and the couple of weird things. So my son also hijacked mine, and we also do it as well. But he's into the maths and the chess and stuff as well.
Oh yeah, my son's been doing those as well. Yeah, and I have to tell them, well, can you keep on the Chinese? It's good for them to be doing the other things, but it's just like that was that. But that's why we've got the Chinese teacher now, and they're working on a book because, like you say, I think it fills in a vital issue with the majority of people who are studying a language of that consistency with vocabulary learning. So, for example, one of my good friends who's amazing at Chinese, he was always there up in the first thing in the morning just writing down characters. And that's what it took. But then that wasn't the only thing that he did, but he was just very good at that. And now he's on Duolingo and he says he's learning Japanese. It's great for that. But the problem is it's filled in a gap in the old curriculum sort of approach that people would have to learning a language, but now everybody's ditched the other side of it. So the pieces aren't all there. So that's why we're getting the Chinese teacher. So they're actually doing it interactive. And then on top of that, we're finding a Chinese kids TV program for them to watch because that really helps with them getting some active use of it and engagement with it, even if they don't fully understand it, because that's how you learn.
the danger with it is that you just become this routine, and you fall into doing and you're not really. It's like going to the gym every day, but using one piece of kit. And you stop feeling the burn very quickly, and you're not really stretching yourself.
Yeah, or just going in and just having to do some sort of symbolic exercise that doesn't actually do anything. You know, you're just like, and you say to people, "Oh, well, I go to the gym every day." You know, and mind you, I think a lot of people in the gym. I don't know if you've been to the gym here, but a lot of people are sat on their phones. Even
oh my
though
god! Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Frustrating.
Yeah.
They're sat there between exercises looking at their phones, and you're just like, they must spend a lot longer than they need to be there. I mean, a lot of them are students, so they have the luxury of time, I suppose.
Yeah, I almost said they need a sign. Not that would make a difference. But like, yeah, there's 5 pieces of kit, and you do a visual sweep of the gym.
Yeah.
And there'll be just everyone sat on a piece of kit on their phone for long periods of time. And you just think, this is what the algorithms are.
Well, and this is the key thing about that. There is I think we're in the midst or the start of a tech backlash, because I don't think people want to be doing that. And this is the whole problem with the stuff that I've been looking at with the research around AI and just technology generally, this sort of technology within it, is that where is the agency of the person to do that? Would they be choosing to do that, to be spending that amount of time? I mean, if you look at the amount of time the data's a bit warped, because you could have apps open on your phone and things, but the amount of time you have on your phone, I mean, people are going like 6-7 hours. I mean, that can be listening to podcasts and things along the lines like that, but it does seem like that people. I don't think that people have. That we have a strong control over our use of technology, and we're starting to see a backlash against that. The other one is lack of headphones on phones, because of the switch away from the wired headphones. Now that they've got Bluetooth, a lot of people just don't bother with them because they might have lost them or whatever, because they're quite expensive. But now on trains and on buses, I was traveling on National Express because there was a cancellation. And the second bus driver was going around people telling them to turn their phones down. And now there's the first time I saw it the other day, a sign up on the train saying, don't watch your phone without headphones on and be having loud. I mean, loud phone calls have always been a bit of an issue. It's trigger happy TV. But the point is that this is a response. And when you see people doing it, you can see brain rot in real time. And that's what some people might say, oh, well, it's just like, people on the tube looking at the newspaper type of thing. But I don't think it is, because that is more of an active thing, active interaction with media that you're doing. Whereas brain rot, a lot of people, it makes me feel a bit sick watching people, or hearing it more than anything, them scrolling through TikTok.
So yeah, I mean, there's a few things going on, and it segues nicely into your study, because it's about what users actually think about the technology underneath the surface. And it's obviously when we think about phone. Did you see this thing? It was just yesterday actually. There was something about companies are now introducing no phone policies at work and giving like lockers and pouches. I forget what it was.
I haven't seen that, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, just for productivity, because you're simply, the distractions, the notifications, once the notification goes, you're in the tractor beam of the algorithm. And it's not like picking up a newspaper back in the day, because of the algorithm its sole purpose is to hold your attention.
Yeah.
And if you look over the shoulder of, not saying I do this, data privacy and everything, but like you watch what people are looking at, and just the swiping, the liking, and it's quite scary. It's like you say, a sense of kind of like utter time wasting, but they're just held there. And I think if you ask them, and there was a piece about this, I forget where I read it, but just the teenagers wishing TikTok could be uninvented, because I think they do recognize that it's.
Oh yeah, I mean, I so there's a couple of things around this. I see it with myself, with YouTube, and I have to limit apps, and then your brain finds ways around them. So it's definitely appealing to a base level of your brain that you don't really consciously have control over. It's a sort of compulsion. I see it with my son especially. Tell him to get off his Switch and then he's got my phone type of thing. And he acknowledges it. And it's about... And a lot of things, if you walk around and see, just here walking around in the library and you see how many devices people have, and I'm not just saying this is just the younger generation, it's, people of all walks of life as well, that you're just in multiple places at once with it. It's not like when you used to come to the library, and there's another point about this as well, about the access to information. When students used to come to university, the library would be sort of the best information you could get. And this would be the place you'd have to go to get it. So if you were looking to research things in the past, you'd have to go to the library. So the internet does give us far more access to far more information. And it's managing that information is incredibly challenging. But I think the principles of it don't really change about the principles of quality information. And the issue with generative AI as it's come along is this, whatever you want to say, double-edged sword or whatever sort of analogy you want to make with it. But that I think it does enable us to a certain extent to digest all of that information. But then you're not too sure the quality of the ingredients of that information, which is where if you don't have information literacy or data literacy, you aren't really able to tell. It's not just the issue around hallucinations, because I think that's a bit overplayed and it does make mistakes type of thing. Statistical anomalies that may come up. But if you're working with a generative AI, as I was doing with this paper, as that was one of the purposes of the paper, then you soon get to know the model that you're working with. However, the models may differ between different conversation. So if you reach a limit on that conversation, whatever, interaction,
the thread
that you're having with, in this case, I was using Claude. You open up a new thread with them, or with it, then it feels like a different iteration of the thread. So I compare it to the film Mickey 17, I think it's called.
I've not seen that.
So I think it's Mickey 17. This is going to be really embarrassing if I've got the wrong number. Anyway, so the point is that he's an iteration of, he's given himself up to be cloned essentially for military and for purposes, scientific experiments and things like that. So he's always cloned, but each clone is, slightly different. So when you've got, and I compare that with the different chats with Claude, you'd be having a really interesting interaction, and then you start up a new one and it just feels slightly different. So it's the same. So it's an interesting relationship there. I mean, as I say in the paper, the thing is about, you say one thing about it at one point, then by the time, especially by the time the paper gets to publication, we're further along with the models. So they're changing all the time. So with Claude projects, where you get a project and you're working together and it knows and it can check all of those conversations, it does improve. And it also, I had one student in one of my interviews, not for this paper, for a different paper, who said they were a teacher and they said they treat the GenAI, the model they were using, like a naughty but incredibly intelligent school child, and that they need to train it to, and this thread came up with a few people, you need to train it to know yourself. Now this goes back to another point, and we can go whichever way you want on this, but about, we were talking about very much anecdotal data, a feeling that everybody has about over-reliance on phones and seeing people, with their brain rot. But the thing is that the companies that own these tools, they have the data. So they know. So when everybody's got all of that data on how many hours a day you're on your phone, they do have that digital shadow of anybody that's using a phone. And it's very, very difficult to to not live along, on those terms and conditions. If you try living without a smartphone or the internet, you become a sort of tinfoil hat person. And anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, this is interesting. As a sidebar on that, I think we've talked on the last couple of podcasts about kind of setting boundaries around digital use, especially in the classroom, and just kind of like deciding where and how is best to curate it. But I think the anecdotal stuff is, obviously you can get carried away with confirmation bias, and you think you're noticing patterns. Oh yeah, everyone at the gym was using it, but it's kind of, it is useful sometimes to look at the data and then introspect over your own use and what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis. I think you can compare that, but the bits that are indisputable is that you've just got, where the devices come in. I mean, their sole purpose is to hold attention. I mean, no, we have to keep in mind incentive structures. You've got devices which are designed to hold users' attention, and in all of the chatbot interfaces, we have now increased prompts for further engagement. Like, they'll end a chat with, do you want me to do, to nudge you, to keep you on the thread? Yeah,
that's a big issue, and especially with your agency with doing tasks with it. So I have conversations, I'm going to say again, interactions with Claude where other generative AI models are available, where that is the problem, where it will just go, it's very difficult. I mean, and I know there are educational models as well. I know there are models with guardrails on, which I think that's something maybe we can go on to discuss, because they are so powerful. And if you were a student working on an assignment, or if you're a researcher working on a paper, it will suggest, the tools will, and this is not just limited to Claude either, the tools will suggest ways to go. It will carry on, and it's like working with another researcher in some ways, and it takes a lot for you to say, hang about, no, don't do that. And in fact, it'll often do a lot of stuff unprompted and start telling you things or looking into things. And then it's funny because you can actually have a conversation. Okay, well, what about the ethics of doing the thing that you just suggested? And then it'll go through the reasoning that it does. Actually, you might get in a lot of trouble if I was do whatever it is that you're talking about, that you're suggesting. So, but that doesn't mean to say it isn't very useful if it's used in the right way in education. But it's like where we started with Duolingo. This is the whole conversation, isn't it? Do we want ideally we want students who want to learn, but then even if the tools were to stop developing today, we have tools now, the capabilities of which are pretty incredible. And because it can do certain things, it's going to massively affect students' motivation. When I say student, any learners, any people's motivation to do those things. And that is the true challenge, because on the flip side of that is the human brain is incredible. When you compare it to AI and the things that it does, it is incredible. But then how do we have this coexistence of the different intelligences?
Well, let's stick a bookmark in that bit, because I think that this links to you have a section in the scoping review about the perceived benefits of how the students saw, how AI could, help them with studies and things. We'll come back to that. But I think I'm conscious we haven't properly introduced the study yet. So give us your elevator pitch. But is it three sections? You've got your scoping review. So what exactly does the literature say at the moment about how students are engaging with AI? You've got your current study where you looked at 7,000 student participants.
Oh, there. Right. So that's a different.
Are they part of the same study, or are they totally different?
Yeah. So the whole project is it's this StudentXGenAI Project, the Student Experiences of Generative AI project. So the dynamic tensions paper is, at the start of any project, you're going to do a literature review. So I thought I'd do a scoping review, but also I wanted to try out different generative AI tools in a sort of experimental, but not in a sort of very controlled conditions experiment, because limited for time, etc. So I just thought I'd approach it like a student would, and like a lot of staff or academics are approaching it with generative AI tools. So I thought I'd do a scoping review rather than a systematic review, so a sort of scoping of a certain area, and use Claude to do that. So within the paper, I talk about the findings from 40 papers that I identified, and I limited my search just around qualitative studies because I was going to do interviews. And then, so it's about the findings of those qualitative studies, my experiences using searching for a generative AI tool, and some sort of considerations with that, and then reflecting on student use, but also researcher use of the generative AI tools together. So a sort of meta approach, quite reflexive, looking at the way it can be used for research and the similarities with the way that students are using it. So that was the literature review at the start of the project. Then I did 20 interviews with students, which I'm working on a paper for. But the main Leverhume Trust funding was for a survey of students in the UK. So the qualitative stuff and the literature review feeding into the survey. So for the survey, I had an idea, and so did working with Professor Sam Illingworth at Edinburgh Napier University. I think I got the fellowship because we had to describe how we do the research, and it mapped with what he had applied for the funding for. And because of that, we've been working really well together, looking at this. And he's got his Substack Slow AI, which is really interesting about using slow AI he comes from a sort of creative pedagogies background, so looking at using AI in a slow and considered way, which is a really interesting way to look at it. So this dynamic tensions paper ties in a bit with that, reflecting on the way we're trying to use GenAI ethically. And then the survey, so I had an idea to do, my main concern was how do we reach students? So there was a survey on academic integrity by Tracy Brettag and colleagues in Australia about 2013, 2014, I think it is. And they'd reached a lot of students. And I remember at the time thinking, if I ever do the survey, I'll use that approach. So when I was starting to put a survey together, I thought, well, maybe they're doing a survey in Australia. And I checked out the previous podcast, we talked about Margaret Behrman's paper. I don't know if you remember. So I'd got in contact with Margaret and was aware, when I looked up, there was the AI and HE project in Australia. So they were running a survey already at 4 institutions. So Margaret put me in touch with Jen Chung and Michael Henderson, at Deakin and Monash, respectively. And they were amazing. And they'd already published their survey, so I could go online and see what the survey was, and I adapted it for a UK audience. Now, my initial intention was to go to 10 institutions. We got 8 in the end. And so we got over 7,000 responses on it, on the survey. And we're working on papers and from that at the moment. And that's in the Advanced HE blog, some of the initial findings. And we're just working on a paper from that. So they're the 3 main sort of segments of the research. So it's really good to be able to have the survey. Surveys are often quite descriptive, and there are discussions about the use of surveys and whether students are over-surveyed. So we've written a draft of a paper we just need to finalise about doing the survey and how we were able to access the numbers of students we did, which was basically through avoiding surveying at the time when the NSS is and when, there's post-module evaluations, post-program, avoiding all of that and finding a window, but also having institutional buy-in. And we did that by having a data sharing agreement where the institutions would get the data for their students, the anonymized data. So we had a data sharing agreement, so they got the data and they can analyze it themselves, but we're doing the aggregated analysis of that data.
Yeah, cool. So some of the questions that you were asking in the survey itself, the survey that went out, this was around, I think the word engagement comes up a fair amount of time. So can you just describe that bit? What sort of info are you looking for from students about their... Is it mainly usage habits around GenAI?
Yeah, so it's their perception. Obviously, it's self-reporting with a survey. So we've got the key demographics. So we've got lots of demographic groups which are mapped with the NSS that we can look at. So that's quite interesting in itself. We've got knowledge and access. Well, first of all, the main thing is, do you use it? Now, in a lot of other surveys, I think they're targeted as students using generative AI. So we were careful with our comms to target. We were saying whether you use it or not, we want to hear from you. Because of that, we got quite a different proportion to other surveys that you may have seen around it. 70% of students are saying they're using it. 30% are saying they're not using it. We're calling these sort of conscientious objectors or late adopters.
But not using it for anything, or just not using it in studies?
Just not using it for anything.
Right.
We had a thing about studies, work, and personal life, because some people will be say, "Oh, it's great for planning a holiday and things like that," but I wouldn't use it in my assessments. I'm too scared to use it. So we've got knowledge and access about how do they know how to use it, how have they learned how to use it, and the majority of people have learned to use it with trial and error, or using internet sources or generative AI. We also asked them about using university resources, and they're very low down on the list of ways that students learn about using generative AI.
Okay.
They're very useful if they use them, but the majority of students are not using that. But that may change as we go along, as universities' resources catch up. So there's about timing, and then about the use and usefulness. So what do you use it for? So what type of tasks? Brainstorming, things like that. Computer coding. We have a list of variables. And then there's attitudinal area of questions around: do you trust the outputs? What your concern? What motivates you to use the tool? And the main motivations are: it makes things easier, it makes things faster, and it helps me to overcome blocks within that.
Yeah, I read that bit when I was going through the scoping review last night. So that it's that's really interesting, the fact that that's perceived as a benefit. And I think there's a line in there where you're a bit skeptical about this, because obviously it is a perceived benefit from students. Might be, this is from the existing lit, so from your scoping review, that it's great because overcomes writer's block, helps me with brainstorming, and I think there was a part where it said, I just get the product done faster. It makes my output faster. So any teacher reading that is going to sort of think, well, this isn't really the point. The point is that certainly your experience here is that we want you to be overcoming cognitive challenges. We want you to be, I think, the idea of brainstorming and coming up with ideas off the back of your reading is quite an important step. But that it was in the bucket of perceived benefits from students, at least. But at the same time, we've got, and if you've seen this just as an example, I know it's not probably representative of more broadly, but there's a petition going around started, I think, at the University of Salford, where students are just kind of like actively pushing back on the encouragement of GenAI in higher education. So there's an awareness in some quarters, certainly, that it's the process, that the point is not to get to the end product as quickly as possible. So how did you see these? What's the picture generally? How did you feel when you read these being benefits? What's your take on what's a benefit versus what we should be sort of promoting as a healthy use of GenAI?
Yeah, so that was definitely this sort of why I called it the dynamic tensions, although I didn't go into as much depth about. I'd like to write another paper about these sort of dynamic tensions, but there is this real tension between productivity and performance and learning. And this goes back to really something I did in my PhD, which was about Chinese learners and understanding issues around plagiarism and academic integrity and their stereotype. But without going too much into theories, grand theories and things, about the way that I'd used Jürgen Habermas in my PhD. Now, before people switch off, it's just very basically the difference between instrumental action, just wanting to complete something, just to get it done, and more communicative action where you are learning to do something and communicating with other people within your society and working together on things. And the problem with instrumental action is it can be very individualistic towards your goals. And if everybody is very instrumental, then the whatever sort of social network you're working in will break down. It's just lots of, and I think this is the real concern with generative AI. I mean, to a certain extent, we see it with the internet as well, with social bubbles between people as well. You know, the biases that you talked about earlier, confirmation bias and things like that. We stop really interacting with people around us in a truthful manner, and we're just all aimed at our own goals, very highly individualistic. So when students are talking about it, I can totally see where they're coming from, that we do seem to be in huge competition with each other, you know, and competition and collaboration are another tension that we have within human development, the way that we coexist together, is that competition can be healthy. You can have healthy competition, but I think certainly within the broader context that generative AI has come into with students, we can understand that they are focused on this productivity and performance and sort of degrees in a massified system where it becomes less of a, and this is where we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, where degrees become less of a thing you're doing because you want to do it and more a thing that you're doing because it's the done thing and everybody's doing that. So university, by making it massified, has become less voluntary for people. And this is what I talk to people about within that. So when people are doing that, it becomes more of a means to an end. And I think it actually, massification of higher education, not done in the original way it was theorized to have been done, which was a lot more part-time study and things, forcing so many young people into full-time education, sort of extended out secondary education, but also in the UK especially. And this is true in a lot of contexts, whether you have a university system which you pay for or one which is paid for through the taxation, you know, if you have allegedly free education in some countries. So this was really interesting about going to a Scottish university, because Scottish students don't pay fees, but affordability of education, all the other things around it are still massive, even without the fees that you have, or without the debt that people are getting into in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, for example. So within that, we have this, as it's less voluntary, it makes people going to be more instrumental about the way they do it. And as there's more and more students involved, the scalability of the system, this is what I talk about with academic integrity, is thinking about the integrity of the structure of the higher education edifice, is that it was struggling already. I mean, COVID put a lot of pressure on it, and it was handled amazingly with the staff, you know, quite rapid digitization. But then generative AI slipped in when we were digitizing a lot of things out of necessity, and also implementing a lot of good things that had been held back by quite a, you know, the slow turning ship of universities with things. So a lot of digital technologies were put into place, and we held it together, and then generative AIs come in there within this context. So this is imagining that student context that they're in, with the focus on employability, taking out loans, all of these other things. And that affects the way that people act. And when you've got this tools coming in saying, oh, everybody's really stressed and getting into debt and things like that, or this tool's going to make things easier, you can understand why they might see that as a benefit.
Yeah, I mean, before I get this next question in, was the main purpose of the study, so gathering all this data to look at, you know, to get an accurate picture of the landscape of student use?
Yeah.
Is the aim for that then to somehow inform institutional policy or steer the direction that universities are going with?
Yeah, so I mean, that was with the data sharing agreements as well, so those institutions, but to have a broad, you know, rather than have a survey of like 1,000 students from 50 or 60 institutions, we thought we'd target, and then we'd get a good data set from a number of institutions that we can we can draw a bit more solid conclusions from the data, but that is the intention, that we can speak about the way that students are using it. Now, on the flip side of that, there is more targeted work on human AI interaction, which I think is really valuable. But it's a lot small scale. But there are larger studies going on where people are really looking at, with eye tracking software, and looking at the generative AI records, the logs. They've got access to them, so they can actually see in real time what students are actually doing with these things. But I think at this stage, as the dust is settling, on the release of ChatGPT, it's helping us to get a picture. So, for example, the benefit of doing it with the Australian institutions running a very similar survey, it's almost identical. There's some slight wordings we've changed for the British audience and degree types things, but the main questions are the same. So we're comparing the data that they've already published in I'll share the link that you can put on the description of this. But what's really interesting going through the data and comparing it is how similar they are, and that's interesting in itself. Now, Australian and UK universities are often quite not tethered to each other, but there are a lot of similarities with them. There's a lot of cross-pollination as well. But it is really quite telling how similar the data is that we're getting. And I think that is of real use value to institutions and students, anybody working in education, basically.
So I think one of the headlines that you mentioned on the HEPI blog was that there's a gap between what you found in terms of student uptake versus, was it the HEPI report?
So the HEPI Cortex survey reports about 92%, and they're talking about universal usage, and it's a really good survey. It's just there's a difference there, and I think that may be down to, as I said, the way we marketed it. There's not complete transparency about the way that the HEPI Cortex survey is. They use a company to target students within that. So we're clearly going to get different statistics. There's quite a lot of other ones out there. Wonk HE did a really good survey, The Secret Life of Students. They did a survey of generative AI use, and in that one they assumed all the students are using it. They say we make the assumption that of universal usage, essentially. But I think, as you said, with the University of Salford, there's also pushbacks from staff at certain institutions as well around this, that there is a pushback. There is conscientious objection about the use of this software. And I don't think it's just the software itself. I think it is the sort of geopolitical, economic context of which that this unregulated use of it, I think that is a problem, similar to social media. There's a good paper from pre-generative AI coming out by the Ada Lovelace Institute called Regulate to Innovate. And I think if this software is going to be useful, I don't know if software is the right word, if generative AI is going to be useful, and especially as it becomes more powerful, it needs to be regulated and it needs to be licensed. How powerful some of these tools already are, the things that you can achieve with them, and they are being used to commit wide-scale fraud around the world and picking up things. There's got to be responsible usage of them.
Yeah, I'll just throw a few random thoughts. I'm collecting them in my head as you're speaking, so I'll try and sift through these as I just rather than fire hose everything at you. But in terms of institutional policies, we've got an idea that, okay, maybe there's more skepticism on behalf of students than we initially thought. Maybe it's not everyone's using it and everyone, this is the way forward. In terms of institutional responses, we've seen things like, for example, versions of the traffic light systems, assessment scale, where everyone's using it. So the rationale goes, well, let's somehow facilitate that and steer it, and students will appreciate that. And then, we've also got concerns around, things that we're offloading. I think that my own concern was its actual utility as a learning tool. I think because there were a lot of studies that, and I say studies, they were really of very mixed quality. There would be a headline that says AI helps critical thinking. When you look at the survey, you look at what's actually been done, it would be self-report. Students feel a sense of self-confidence when using generative AI that's just not mirrored in when you measure the learning gains. So its efficacy as a learning tool is really in question. And there just seems a tension between, do we create conditions where, ban is the wrong word. We create conditions where we just regulate it as we are teaching you students how to build these skills for yourself, versus go nuts with AI because it's the tool of the future. They do seem to be sort of they're not compatible directions. So when we look at this survey data and we get a fuller picture of what students what they're doing and what they actually think, what's your sense about the direction that institutions generally need to go in with their response and how they treat it? I mean, you've mentioned regulation a few times. How do you sort of see that playing out?
Yeah, and I think that the work, that Perkins, Rowan, Furs, or Furs, Rowan, Perkins, whatever order you want to put in the way, is brilliant, on the AI assessment scale and moving away from the traffic lights because of the connotations around, the confusion can be around. It is brilliant. And that is a really good approach to having it, or Danny Liu's two-lane approach. I think that is the way that we should approach it. And within that, there's room for regulation because if you take the traffic light because it's more simple, the red light is essentially regulating it. So even though people say, oh, well, you can't ban it, by having a traffic light system or a two-lane approach, you are saying that it should be regulated. I think the big thing for me is around this a false binary around using AI or not using it. That comes very much from the Silicon Valley playbook, is that you can't live without this technology within that. And I think it pits us against each other with working with this technology. And the traffic light system or any of the AI assessment scales, I think if you were to implement one of those fully, what you would see over time would be that we'd start to learn how to use it. So it'd start off, if you have all the assessments in the universities and which ones, and staff are assigning these things, staff will assign a red, a green, or an amber on there. You would see most of them being red to begin with, and then some ambers coming in and very few greens, which is the problem with that system or the two-lane approach. And slowly over time, they would drift over to amber, which is why you'd see a different color within there, where there might be uses within that you can use it for. So I think there's always been that false binary between those things. So where I think institutions should be going with it is that, and remember, I've been looking at this not just with generative AI, but I got into this through in about 2018, 2019 with translation software. I don't know whether you were at the talk in language and linguistics.
I didn't go to that one. You gave a talk at one of our BALIP.
So that was 2020.
That was 21.
Yeah. So, but prior to that was more when I'd shifted onto generative AI because I'd started to look at it more specifically, and it was still had the translation software. But before that, the canary in the coal mine around generative AI for me was translation software, because I was working with academics at York and York St. John. They were mainly from the languages department, though, modern languages department. Whereas I was coming at it from an English as a medium of instruction, working mainly with Chinese students, but other, English as a foreign language students, so English for academic purposes type of thing. But there was a definite synergy between us around challenges this whole problem, which is where we come back to Duolingo, of language learning when you have a translation tool becomes a different game within there. So, and my point here is that with the approach that we've had, where, the Russell Group come out with really good but quite vague principles. I think they've been in, looking at doing different ones for a while, but it's really, really tricky to know how to approach this. But for flipping from this initial reaction, the knee-jerk reaction was students can't use this. And then the other reaction was, well, we can't stop them from using it. So we've got to go with this. It's going to be the future. Whereas now we're getting to the point where not much is really sticking, I think. This is the impression I get from people, that staff don't trust the students don't trust other students, and students don't trust the staff not to use it either for marking. And I've got a key point about the data as well, so which I shouldn't forget. So I think where we need to go with this, and I said this at the time when I was still here at York, which was about what the survey data shows is that students appreciate clarity and they want to do the right thing. So my mantra is that majority of students are honest the majority of the time. And our data and the Australian data shows this, that 60-70% of students will be honest. If you tell them not to use generative AI, they won't use it. And I think this is something we really need to hold on to, because majority of people want to be honest and do the right thing. But there's a significant minority, about 20-30%, that may use generative AI when it's not allowed. And there's a hardcore within that 20 to 30%, 10 to 15% usually, that will just go, well, they self-report anyway. I'm just going to use it, very instrumental approaches. But that sort of data that we've got, and there was a discussion on LinkedIn about this the other day. So people like Guy Curtis and Phil Newton who look at academic integrity research historically, this matches with the number of students that were self-reporting about contract cheating and about just cheating or deliberately plagiarizing within that. And while they may be underreporting, usually there's an underestimate. The point is that the majority still are honest the majority of the time. So what do we do? How do we find the balance between the security of the assessments and then trusting those rest of the students? Because as Phil Dawson's work shows, which is really excellent, around the assessment security measures you put in place, then they impact the validity of the assessment. So we've got to find this balance between validity and integrity within those things. And the way that I think we should do this is that we take a step back, and then instead of having the traffic light system or the two-lane systems, is that we have targeted experimental modules where students and staff work together and we see how people are really learning it. So you can, have, and these can be in different departments and things, but fund AI champions really in different departments where there's a sort of learning technologist and learning enhancement people who are specialists with the AI technology, working with the academic who wants to see it, and working with the students as well, and maybe a departmental AI sort of evangelist or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, I'll be the evangelist.
Yeah. So working together and seeing what's really working, and then going to other departments and saying, other modules and things. Well, actually, we've tried these things, and these are the way it's working within that. So, the other point beyond that is that, people talk about, it's not just about a generative AI, but wearables and things. I'm not wearing smart glasses, but we're increasingly moving into that territory. And there needs to be a strong social debate about the data and privacy issues within that.
Yeah, I've got there's a paper by Thomas Corbyn.
Yeah. So they've just done a paper about that. And Jasper Rowe, Durham, he's doing a personal experiment at the moment with wearing the glasses all the time. I've been following bits.
So I've been trying to get off LinkedIn a lot recently for reasons that we've covered. But, I had a quick question, but you're all right for time? Or
I can go on a bit longer. Yeah, it's fine.
So just to throw in to what you just said, I mean, I think if we say the majority of students are honest the majority of the time, and this then has an informing effect on our institutional responses, I think there's an extra layer of the dynamics that's going on here. The students that are honest, or the students who simply recognise that AI isn't helping them in this sense, and they want to do it themselves. They want to go through the friction of the learning experience. They want to take the long way around because they understand that this is the best way to internalise a lot of what they're being taught. And they don't really see a place for AI. But at the same time, because of the incentive structures that we put in place, the sort of extrinsic motivating factors overshadow that desire to do it yourself. So I want to I want to do this in the way it was intended, but I can see that an unknown percentage of my classmates are using AI. I know that it's not going to be picked up, and I know that they're using it to an extent to give an impression that they know more about the subject than they actually do. Therefore, these students who are the genuinely honest students who want to go through, they don't want to deceive anyone, they want to go through the learning process, they feel like they can't because they don't want to be at the tail end of the bell curve. So they're this extrinsic motivating factor is just pushing them into, I think this might be, I don't want to speculate too much, it might be where some of the rationale for the Salford petition came from is just because they feel like, this is not what I signed up for. I want to actually learn this stuff, but I don't feel like I can afford to do the work in the way it was intended. So if we kind of lean too heavily on traffic light systems and go towards amber assignments where, hey, of course, just report and tell us how you used it and maybe send some screenshots of the prompts. This is...
Yeah, and who's going to have time to check all that anyway? So,
and back to this original question, does it actually provide evidence that you're learning the core material?
Yeah, and I think that is where this especially, I mean, contract cheating before it to a certain extent, but it wasn't so obvious. But when you've got, for example, an international student in front of you who can't speak, English properly, and you're looking at an essay that's written perfectly, that something's up there. I mean, before contract cheating, or even other, it can be, people have partners that help them out with their work. There's always been this murky grey area around how actually people produce the outputs. But what generative AI is really causing us to reflect on is how we learn. Yeah. And that is why I think it can be valuable in the right hands in that. And this was something we discussed last time, which Lucy, who was with us on the podcast, rightfully pushed back against, was about having data for students at school and who's in control of that data. And this is something where the work of somebody like Shoshana Zuboff and surveillance capitalism comes in, of the issues of this very coercive system of surveillance that we have online, or Yanis Varoufakis talking about techno-feudalism. This is the problem, where it's not just that technology, is it? It's this whole geopolitical, economic context that higher education and learning fits into. So I think this is where we need to try and control that narrative, and the narrative that students hear about as well. About, at the moment, students, there's a lot of suspicion because there is the sense that everybody's using it to cheat. But when you talk to students about it, you get quite a different picture. Saying that, you don't talk to the Moriartys of the world, or who are using it in a way, but then those people always existed and do exist high up in the corridors of power. So then we get more into this discussion around integrity in society, and the whole thing about talking, we've barely touched on hardly any of the issues in the paper, but around the benefits of productivity. There is a productivity sort of cult with Diary of a CEO and all of these different podcasts. But within that, there's this fake it till you make it sort of culture. So there's my mantra. So this is a big tension. It's an interesting one to end on. Is my mantra between the majority of students are honest the majority of the time, versus the maxim, you're only cheating yourself. But I don't think that that's necessarily, when I look around in society, my feeling is You don't really get that sense anymore that small percentage of people are not, they're cheating everybody else. And I think this ties in with the pushback against the technology and things with that, about integrity, validity of assessment, and trust and fairness in society, which really reflects on our higher education system. It's just like, and then that reflects back in, well, what's really the point of all of this, that we all sort of ask ourselves these questions. So I think we're still at a challenging time since the release of ChatGPT around it, after a very traumatic period with COVID in higher education. But I don't think we need to give up hope around working with this and pushing back on that narrative of the false binary. I think we should, I really like that Ada Lovelace paper, Regulate to Innovate. That's the stage that we're at now, is that let's take a step back and start looking really controlled and looking at the studies which are being done on human AI interaction. And I think we'll look at different ways between that, product-based assessment, where you've got the end product and you've got no idea how it's got to that, versus more really continuous assessment. And this is where it ties back into the Duolingo of looking at the data and what works. But that is a dangerous area itself, because then you can be looking into, digital predestination of students, where there's an analysis of the brain and, you're going to do this job. And that is that huge tension between what works in the ideal AI world of having data control and self-driving cars and all of these things. It's very mechanistic, and we lose our freedom within that, which is quite anti sort of neoliberal principles within that.
Because I was also going to pick up on your point about, the reaction from institutions immediately was, let's ban it. Because that wasn't what I picked up. What concerned me was the opposite. It was this kind of immediate, and I still get this from colleagues now, is we should be adjusting our teaching around AI. And, it's the word embrace has been coming up for years and years without any really, really being defined. But that was the bit that concerned me. I was kind of like, well, embrace it to what end? What do you mean AI skills? I don't really think that writing a prompt is a skill in the same sense that, learning the stuff it's replacing is a skill. So these were sort of concerns that were rattling around my brain. But when I looked at the responses from Australia, they did seem to be going in a different direction, because you mentioned there are a lot of parallels. And I think this was a point I asked Mike Perkins when he was on the podcast a few months ago. The Australians seem to go, according to what I was reading, they went back to pen and paper exams. That became that there was a concern around security, and it might have been around the differences between TEXA and Office for Students. And we kind of were still working on a sort of post-COVID mindset of very, very enhanced trust levels. So, take an exam, go and do it online, have a 6-hour window, don't worry about the exam conditions. We trust you. And then it's, to me, that was quite, we just had this such, if you look back at exam regulations from pre-COVID eras and some, look at how exams were set up, look at the security around them. What you wanted to do was just remove all extrinsic variables and make sure that all you had was a person in the room and their brain, and then work with that. And that was how you created your level playing field. And then in post-COVID, it became all about going very, very unsupervised. I think the majority of the universities, it's fair to say, were not using proctored tools in any sense. Yeah. So I just got the opposite sense of that. I got the sense that we were really sort of putting trust in students to a degree. Not that it's, this paranoid skepticism that everyone's going to cheat. It's simply a worrying lack of attention to assessment security and what impact that's going to have on motivations and really what students are leaving with from their experience. So, yeah, That's not really a question, I appreciate, but is that
Yeah,
very
I
different
don't
from your
want to talk
perception?
about the Australian experience in terms of their post-COVID, but I do get the sense that they're it's been a similar road, but I think that they've been, I mean, Texa, for example, brought a lot of the top academics together, and they've written some really good papers. If you look at the Texa papers, I can share some links around looking at programmatic assessment in the future. And there was just a statement for Australian Education Call for Action on AI in education, the Castlereagh statement just before Christmas. So we can share that as well. I haven't looked through that in detail, but that seems along the lines that you're saying about how this is why I'm getting the impression we're at this stage where actually we're reconsidering our approach with it. So I definitely saw bans initially. Oxford and Cambridge, I think. Oxford certainly initially were ban. Now
they've gone all in, right? They've
now one of the Oxford institutions is working with OpenAI. I understand, but this is quite a long period. It's 2026 now, so it came out the end of 2022. So I think we've been through that initial knee-jerk reaction. Was like when people see it, they were like, "Oh, people can't use this." All right, and then swinging the other way to more embrace, and now we're getting back to more of a, I think it's not much different to what I said earlier, but in terms of assessment, I've thought long about this, and again, reference, Phil Dawson's work on this, which is brilliant. But about, you talk about extrinsic motivation though for assessments, for exams, in-person exams. It's a weird thing, isn't it, about how it forces you to knuckle down, or whatever words people would use around that you're going to have that high stakes moment of assessment within that period. But then the challenges, talk about tensions as well with authentic assessment that people talk about as well. You're rarely going to be, put to the test in that sort of way. Personally, for me now, being an adult, semi-functional adult, is that I feel that everything's like an exam these days, that everything's high stakes and you need to be getting on, getting on with things. And I break my day up into different periods of time. I'm like, right, okay, exam conditions, I need to get on with this. So you sort of internalized that way of doing things. But going back to the closed exams, that you had invigilators there, and people talk about, digital, we're not going to get onto AI detection or anything like that, but just digital proctoring being biased. But how many sort of retiree people who were doing invigilation in the past would be focusing on certain students or any of these other things that they might be picking up on? So there's certain transferability of the issues around that with examinations, and the problem of people saying, they come back with examinations, those sort of closed examinations, it's not a memory test, and sometimes a memory test is needed, for foundational skills and things. Depends what you're teaching. So I just get the sense that COVID did change a lot, and things didn't go back. We're in the whatever terrible phrase you want to use, like the new normal, that we haven't quite, the challenge to trust of the digital world, we haven't quite managed to find our way with that. And having so much information at our fingertips, it's, with great power becomes great responsibility. And universities have really, there is that weird sort of, I don't know if it's a paradox, but that universities are really concerned about with student data and things, and for the right reasons, GDPR and all of these type of things. And students are really hot on it. Students' unions are really hot on if universities have apps and things like that. And if you're using digital invigilation or collecting any student data, but then we're fine to go, oh, right, we'll just go and have a play around with ChatGPT and or any of the other models and use that for your assessments. So then you move over to where we're going with this. So one of the things we looked at in the survey was how much students were spending on generative AI tools. And essentially the freemium era of AI is coming to an end now as they need to finance. Might make all of these conversations redundant if there's financial collapse, which is a possibility. And the generative AI becomes the Easter Island head of our society, these relics of the sort of technology and things that we could do. But University of Manchester has given Copilot to all students and staff relatively recently. I think a lot of institutions give access to students. But what our survey data showed was that not many students were paying for it, but not many students were using the university offered
that's the impression
tools.
I got as well. Yeah.
That most students are using the free tools, which throws up all data security issues. And we, as institutions, we can't be encouraging students to be using tools for things that we are expecting students to use. The universities have to provide the tools, and I think that's where the regulation comes in. I think there will be further regulation around that. You're not going to be able to... I mean, there is a certain amount of regulation around people under a certain age can't use generative AI tools and things. But I think that's where the regulation and the guardrails will come in, and the generative AI will very much be used in a different sort of a way with student learning, that it may be a tutor or an invigilator, but it just depends how we use that information and who owns the information. And Ben Williamson does some really amazing work at Edinburgh around big data in education and the problems around edtech within this space, really, around private companies having access to all of this educational data in that. So that is what universities need to get there. I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration between institutions and collaborating as a block to negotiate with the companies. I think that universities can have a lot of clout together. And I think in the UK, that's not perhaps where we're working as well as, say, in Australia, from what I've seen. However, saying that, JISC is doing really excellent work on providing guidance. Their blog's really good, useful around this. But from institutions, I think everybody's trying to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of work going on, but it's not joined up enough.
Yeah. So one to finish on then, what's the next big question that needs answering around GenAI education? And not to mention we're a language teaching podcast basically as well. So
language teaching. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the thing, is just how can we... to reflect on that perceived benefit of productivity. That's clearly because if a student can be productive and perform well without learning very well, then there's a huge assessment validity problem that we have if the assessment is not showing what the student is learning. So can AI help us with that to really unlock that approach with students so that we are really genuinely assessing learning and the way that we learn, essentially? I think that is where we're going with that. And I mean, in terms of AI, we're moving on to the more agentic approach. I suppose that's the other thing. I think agents, I mean, certainly for institutions, an agentic approach to quality assurance and testing of assessment data and all of this stuff could be very, very useful. But only working alongside the human expertise, so having a human in the loop with these agents, and that's dangerous. And then robotics is the next. We don't have time for that.
Yeah, no. There's a bunch of questions that spring to mind again, but let's have mercy on the audience. So okay. So give us what name of the paper? Can you give us the details again? I'll put a link in the show notes. When's the paper actually out? Is it because I've got the HEPI blog here? When's your final? Have you got publication
the
date?
Advanced HE blog. We're not too sure about that at the moment. Publication times take a while. We're hoping to get a pre-publication version out by the end of the month. So that paper, it's going to be called something along the lines of "It is a temptation to get it to do the work: Students' experiences of navigating the generative AI landscape in UK higher education." So that's going to be the broad scope look at the paper, comparing with the paper by Chung, Henderson, Slade et al., the excellent research project over there, which is the use and usefulness of generative AI in higher education, student experience and perspective. So that's the Australian paper, and then we're comparing the UK data with that. So as a pair of papers, they'll be very interesting to, for institutions to look at these larger scale surveys.
Nice. Okay. Place to end. Right. Links as always in the show notes. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you so much.